Shalom and a warm welcome to you as this is yet another session in our series called The Life of Christ in Context. Today's focus in this session will be what Jesus did. I hope that this session will be enlightening to you and encouraging to your walk of faith. There is so much to talk about in relationship to the life and ministry of Jesus. Now, in this session, we're going to focus upon what Jesus did, although what I have presented for you, of course, we could expand many times over just because of the exhaustive nature of the ministry of Jesus as recorded in the Gospels. So, what we're going to do is sort of build upon our theme, our goal of seeing Jesus through the lens of the historical. And again, all these sort of blend together, even in this session, the geographical, the archaeological, the chronological, and the cultural or the Hebraic background, and certainly the soteriological or the redemptive uh, purpose of Christ's coming as we understand redemptive history fulfilled by Jesus. We're going to strive to get to know Jesus better in terms of, as we have already done, where Jesus lived, who Jesus was, but what Jesus did is our focus in this session, although in upcoming sessions we'll also explore where Jesus taught, how Jesus taught, what Jesus taught, and certainly why Jesus taught. This will give us a broad picture of the ministry of Jesus. And in between, incidentally, these solo sessions that I'm recording here in our office, I will be inviting guest speakers, friends of mine, who will also share their expertise. So that'll be, I think, complementary to what we can accomplish together. So, in terms of what Jesus did, we first have to say within the Hebraic cultural background of the first century, Jesus taught as an itinerant rabbi and with smekah. Here's a Hebrew term that I think is important for us to understand. Smekah means authority, and Jesus was deemed with authority. We can see this through his teaching, through his healing, through other miracles as well. And now Jesus is recognized as one who has smekah. It's a very important concept because even when Jesus would teach, and of course we'll talk about what Jesus taught and how he taught in upcoming sessions, but even sitting down, think of Matthew chapter 5, and Jesus gathered on the hillside and he sat down to teach. That's really important. So we'll be looking at different aspects of how Jesus displayed his smekah. But just know that his primary message was all about the Malchut Shemaim, this kingdom of heaven. This is a term that appears in Matthew chapter 5, and Jesus tells us that it was at hand, which means it was present. It was a present reality. I know we can talk theologically about the already but not yet aspects of the kingdom. I know theologians like to talk about this. We live in that tension, of course, still today in the 21st century. But Jesus certainly focused on the already aspect of the kingdom, the Malchut Shemaim, because the kingdom of heaven or kingdom of God, I'm using those two terms similarly, they're one and the same, if you will. But the kingdom of God was all about the reign and rule of God in someone's life. And of course, Jesus, like every other rabbi, was gathering a following to take hold of this kingdom that was present and initiated by Jesus. So that's a big, big step, if you will, and can I say, an attribute of a messianic figure. You were to bring about the kingdom. Now, most Messiah like figures in the first century were aiming to bring about a political kingdom, but not Jesus. He was all about bringing in a spiritual kingdom where God's reign and rule was certainly now relevant to people, and people were accepting Jesus as this Messiah and the kingship and the kingdom, I should say, that he was bringing to that area. So Jesus taught the kingdom everywhere. Now, when I read from Matthew 5, of course, we read about Matthew giving us the perspective of Jesus teaching somewhere on the hillside, and that was probably to many people. In fact, this is the traditional Mount of Beatitudes, a Swedish audiology team, excuse me, actually uh, performed some testing here, and they determined that it was a hillside where at least 5 or 6 thousand people could hear Jesus, as his voice perhaps would carry from down below up to this natural amphitheater. But also, Luke tells us in chapter 6, I believe it is, that Jesus taught the kingdom message on the plain. Could be the plain of Gennesaret. Now, is there a conflict or a discrepancy between the Gospels? Of course not, because the kingdom was his go-to message. He taught it everywhere. In fact, I'm going to suggest that perhaps it wasn't the hillside identified now by our Catholic friends as the Mount of Beatitudes, but why not on the lower slopes of the Arbel? We can see the Arbel Cliff, the higher one, and the one to the west, and then this valley that goes right between. It's called the Valley of the Doves. And everyone traveled from Nazareth to the from the lower Galilee into the lake area through this valley. And why not this area of the lower hills of the Arbel? Now, it's not mentioned specifically, but I would like to think that maybe it was here where Jesus taught about the present reality of the kingdom. But Jesus also observed Jewish laws and practices. Now, the picture you see here are two individuals, some Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jews who are praying and are wearing what is called a tallit. A tallit. Now, you can also see wrapped around their arm here, and actually they're wearing a little box that looks like, well, we'll get to that in a slide or two. It was also worn on, and still is, the head, so that these little boxes that contain scripture are closest to your head and your heart. But what a great picture of these guys wearing a tallit. And even this guy, I had to throw in a picture of a guy in the snow underneath this bush here that's growing out of the western wall. But we're not sure. In fact, probably not. The shape of the tallit, as you can see, it's a sort of a long rectangular shape. But we think that the cloak that Jesus wore was maybe more worn as a wrapping, if you will, perhaps a little longer, and certainly not the size of a tallit today. It's sort of Europeanized, but there is this telephine, or the phylactery, as Matthew 23 tells us, contained in this box, worn on their arm and around their head. You can't see it because of the tallit is covering it. Contains some scriptures. So, in fact, you can even see this letter Shin. It's not only the first letter of the word Shema, as in Hear, O Israel, Deuteronomy 6:4, but it's also the first letter of the title of God, El Shaddai, El Shaddai. It appears on all of these telephone and even the mezuzahs that are placed on the doorframe of your house. Where does this come from? Where does this tradition come from? It's not really a tradition, it's a biblical command. We read this about the wearing of the tallit or the prayer shawl in Numbers chapter 15. The Lord said to Moshe, speak to the Israelites and say to them throughout the generations, and to come, you are to make tassels on the corners or the hem. We'll talk about the kanafim, the plural. Kanaf is the word for hem of your garments, but with a blue cord on each tassel. You will have these tassels to look at so that you will remember all the commands of the Lord. Now, this is what um, we wear, or Orthodox Jews wear, when they are praying individually. They are literally wrapping themselves within the canopy of God's presence. There's also a talit katan, the Hebrew word for small, that's worn sort of underneath the shirt, and yet also the tassels hang from the hem as well. But when I think of this particular uh, tallit and prayer shawl that no doubt Jesus wore, although it probably took the form of a cloak more than a shawl. I think of the story in Luke 8. It's a really moving story. Jesus just sails back. It's not mentioned that it's Capernaum, but most likely it is. And Jesus is befriended, if you will, by a woman who has an issue of bleeding. And what does she do? Is she reaches for the kanaf, the hem of the garment. Now, why would she do this? This image, by the way, is from the wall relief at the basement of the Magdala Chapel. Maybe you have been there. It's a beautiful display of what happened. In fact, I'd like to take a look at Luke chapter 8, because when we read that Jesus was on his way here, the crowds were waiting for him and almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him, try to imagine this, and touched the edge of his cloak, the kanaf, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Who touched me? Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. But Jesus said, Someone touched me. I know that that power has gone out from me. Then the woman, seeing that she could no longer go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, it's the only time that Jesus would refer to a woman with this tender expression. He would say, Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Daughter, your faith has healed you. So why do you think initially she was reaching for the hem or the tzitz, the tassels that were attached to the corner, the hem, the kanafim of the garment? Well, look at what we can read in Hebrew, especially when we take a look at Malachi chapter 4. Because kanafim also means wings, perhaps this woman, in her desperate state, believed that Jesus was the Messiah and that he would be the one to fulfill what Malachi chapter 4 tells us, verse 2. But you who reveal my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings. Interestingly enough, the word wings also kanafim. It can be translated wings as well as hem. So could it be that this woman was certainly revering the name of Jesus, identifying him as the Messiah in terms of what Jesus was doing at this point, and she became healed. And this issue of bleeding was now behind her. And Jesus again identifies not the touching of his garment that healed her, but rather it was her faith in who he was. I think it's a moving narrative here in Luke chapter 8. But let's also stop and pause to understand that Jesus called disciples. The word is talmudim. That's the plural of Talmud, a learner, a follower. I think the word goes deeper than our word disciple. In fact, here along the coastline of Capernaum is probably where Jesus called Peter, Andrew, James, and John. In fact, here's the Arbel Cliff that I pointed out before in the Valley of the Doves. This would have led right into the lower Galilee, leading to Nazareth. But could it be here on this northwestern corner where we read this? As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, called Peter, and his brother Andrew, and they were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left the nets and followed him, and going on from there, he saw two other brothers. This would be James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Jesus, of course, would call 12 initial disciples, but just understand that it was quite common for a rabbi to invite people to be followers of them in his teaching. For instance, the two leading rabbis just prior to the time of Jesus were two guys named Hillel and Shammai. And you can see that one of them called 120 disciples and the other called 30 disciples. So speaking about Hillel, there was once, as the story goes, a Gentile who said to Hillel, "Teach me the Torah while I stand on one leg and I'll convert." So what did Hillel say in response? What you do not want someone to do to you, do not do to them. This sums up the Torah, and the rest is commentary. Now you must go and learn it. You probably are familiar with what Jesus is, the golden rule, if you will. But Jesus takes what Hillel most likely was implying and he sort of tweaks it into the positive. Jesus would do this, as we'll learn in terms of what Jesus taught in upcoming sessions. So Jesus was very rabbinic, if you will, and called initially 12 people. But as an itinerant rabbi with Svikah, Jesus also was teaching in synagogues. And this one, as we'll see in a number of sessions, especially the ones that focus on the archaeological connections with Jesus, this was a synagogue found at Magdala that we can even walk around today. In fact, there's a roof, a pavilion over it today, but before that was established, you can see it when just as it was discovered under only about 14 inches of debris. You can see the initial inside benches and the outer bench as well. Maybe in the inside, maybe 40 or 50 people could be there, but we know that from Matthew 4 and Matthew 9, Jesus went throughout the Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. There it is, the kingdom is primary, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. The healings, as we will talk about later, the miracles of Jesus were to reflect the authority that Jesus had. So here is a close-up of the synagogue. Once we were here in the morning when the lead archaeologist was having his son bar mitzvahed in the synagogue and even on this first century platform stone where most likely the scroll was placed. So with permission, we asked to sit into the synagogue with hearing a lecture from the associate archaeologist. It was really a neat experience Today, of course, you can only walk around this synagogue. As I mentioned, it has a roof over it to protect it, and it rightly is there to do just that. But can you picture Jesus teaching in this synagogue about the kingdom? Now, there's another one up north. Gamla is the site. Gamla. This is credit to Archaeology Illustrated, what maybe the city looked like prior to its destruction in 67 AD at the time of the first revolt. But there is the synagogue just inside the city wall and the tower. Josephus incidentally talks about how the city was devastated by the Romans. But here is that first century synagogue. It's a little bigger than the one at Magdala, but certainly still very small, relatively speaking, to our big churches today, if you will. And there it is. Jesus taught most likely here. The location of Gamla's, the city, and the synagogue, of course, is 6 miles due east of the north tip of the Sea of Galilee. So when we talk about what else Jesus did, we could and need to talk about his miracles. Now, the chronological order of his miracles is listed on this chart, and of course, we're not spending time to get into that detail, but you can see, first of all, the water into wine at Cana. A lot of things happened in the Galilee, at Capernaum specifically. A few things happened in Jerusalem. In the Decapolis, that would be on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. But you can locate these miracles most likely in the order that they took place. Now, we're going to also have a friend of mine share some of his expertise on the chronology of Jesus. So we're not necessarily taking this chart as completely accurate, but I think at least it lists them. This gentleman, this is not my chart, but we have 37 miracles represented on this chart. But we sort of want to walk through some of these, not only maybe what and how the movies portray these events taking place, like this one, the man at the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem, after almost 40 years of being lame. You remember the story in John 5, Jesus asked, well, do you want to get well? It's an interesting question, isn't it? For someone like Jesus to ask someone who's been an invalid for so many years. But we can actually use archaeology to pinpoint the pool itself. Now, disregard all this stuff above. This is either Byzantine or Crusader, much later, but the lower steps that you see illustrated in front of us are the original steps of this pool. It was a two-pool system, if you will, had 5 colonnades according to the Bible, and Jesus again befriends this guy, even sees him later on in the temple, which was only about 150 yards or so, 200 yards to the south. So the pools of Bethesda, what Jesus did is he performed miracles. And then John 9, it's a miracle that reminds us of the authority that Jesus had in healing this guy who was born blind. In fact, it's a very interesting story. It's the longest healing narrative. Let's just assume that maybe Jesus befriended him near the south wall or the southwest corner of the temple. Well, if that's the case, this man would have been accompanied by his parents, who are a big part in the story, and helped by his friends down this Herodian pavement. It's called the Pilgrim Road today. We date it based on coins to about 30 AD. But it's from the south wall of the temple. You would have walked down this particular road and down to the south end. Of course, that's where Jesus says, go wash your eyes in the pool of Siloam. What an amazing display of authority here. I love this really detailed illustration. Here's the uh, the Herodian road, I should say, this pilgrim road that allowed people to connect down to the southern end of the city. It was confined by the city wall, of course. Here is what was the City David. Here's the Kidron Valley. And this pilgrim road really sort of occupied this area called the Taropian or the Middle Cheesemakers Valley. But nonetheless, the Shalom Pool is where this guy goes, and what a story! This picture is actually compliments of Dr. Todd Bolin in Bible Places. It was 2005, I believe, where they were working on a pipe and they found the first steps of what was believed and still is by most the steps of the Pool of Siloam. I'm saying this sort of just carefully because there's a new theory that the pool, uh, where if you walk through Hezekiah's tunnel, there was a Byzantine church there that honored what was identified as a first century pool, according to some archaeologists, Bliss and Dickey, back over 100 years ago. Now, there's a theory that that was the Pool of Siloam, and this was simply just a pool for use and cleansing, whereas the other one was the ritual pool where the man went. But let's just hold on to the basic uh, location, if you will, and stick with the 2005 discovery of the Pool of Siloam here. Now, incidentally, this past year, they've been actually digging and trying to find more steps over here in this area, an area that's owned by the Greek Orthodox. Somehow, the city of David got permission to excavate this, and that's a good thing, I think. But we'll see what they end up discovering. We don't think they're going to find any more steps just because this open area was not protected by a Byzantine road. I understand that protected these stones from being stolen or looted and used elsewhere. But let's get back to the miracles of Jesus. Of course, miracles of Jesus includes the feeding of the 5,000. It's recorded in all four Gospels, and we think that it happened in a remote place just to the north of Capernaum, Jesus' home base here. This is the northwest corner and the north corner of the lake, and maybe it was here in the area of Bethsaida. Now, this is certainly a desolate area today, though the Jordan River flows in from the north into the lake here, and there are some that hint that the river actually flowed in further east into the lake and not the route that it takes today. That's a topic for another time, but can you picture Jesus healing, or excuse me, feeding, I should say, more than 5,000 people? And there's a traditional location located back even south of Capernaum today called Tabka that preserves at least the narrative of the feeding of the 5,000 with the loaves and the fish. We think it's the wrong uh, area or location, but nonetheless, the story is preserved. Jesus, of course, performed miracles of calming the water. Again, this display, this picture, maybe captures it all. In this case, Jesus is coming walking to them. Well, I'm not sure if the waves were this high, although back in when was it? 1992, I think 8 or 9 foot waves were recorded crashing on the shores of Tiberias. But nonetheless, this is typically what the Sea of Galilee looks like. We do get something called the Sharkia winds from the east. They blow waves, of course, on the western shoreline, but most of the time the winds are prevailing from the west, blowing eastward. But can you imagine or picture yourself in a boat like this, discovered in 1986 at a place called Naf Guinnessar? Like you can see it being floated out in styrofoam back on the water. But look at this picture uh, from 1986. What a wonderful discovery. First century boat. Can you believe it? And I'll just go back to this picture because it's incredible knowing that this boat could fit 12, 14 people. And certainly the Mark 4 passage, when Jesus is displaying his authority over the winds and waves there, he's sleeping in the stern, and he's waking up and then says, "Peace, be still." In Matthew 14, the narrative I like to read, right after the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus then comes walking on the water to them, and it's, of course, Peter who gets out of the boat. Of course, the multiplication of fish as well, when these fishermen are toiling all night and not catching anything. Of course, this is an artistic perspective, but the Chosen, I think, does a really good job, amazing job with new technology to preserve the miracle of the fish. And of course, back to Matthew 14, just different artistic renditions of walking on the water. The Mark 5 story is one of my favorite stories of transformation. We have this demoniac on the eastern side. And of course, Jesus is the one, the only one, apparently, who gets out of the boat here in the area of the Decapolis and exorcises his demons. And the demons go running down the cliff into the water. Now, on this eastern side, even though about a three-fourths of a mile north, there's a traditional place called Kersey. You can't quite see it. It's around this cliff area. But truly, this is the only cliff that comes close to going down to the water's edge. Now, probably the water was a little higher back in the first century, but you can picture the pigs or the boar now possessed with demons running down this cliff and drowning in the lake. I have a funny story, if I may just briefly share. I was on a filming trip and I was droning right up here. And I was droning this cliff. I didn't get this angle before, and droning along the shoreline to get a great perspective. And all of a sudden, the drone went voop, 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 all the way out towards the middle of the lake. My friend who said, "Man, Delancey, you're really getting good with the drone." I go, "No, I've lost control of it." So, of course, I hit home, 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 which, of course, should bring the drone back, but it did not all the way. So it did come back a little, hovering about 200 yards out from the shoreline, about 3 feet above the lake. So the decision was, well, do I run down the cliffs like the boar did and maybe hop in the water, or do we drive around and then run down the shoreline? This is what I did. And then ask the fishermen if they can still see it. I could, but by the way, by the time I got down here, I could still see it on my screen, but I sort of just, let's just say, took off my shorts, had some undergarments on, and went into the lake that way. And by the time I got out there, the drone had sunk. So unfortunately, I lost a drone, but I'm telling you the story to basically milk the story for what it's worth. Maybe it was the IDF who took over the drone signal. Maybe it was just a malfunction. Or I don't think this is theologically correct, but just like the boar who were demon possessed, who went down the cliff and crashed and drowned in the lake. Who knows? Maybe my drone was sort of affected that way. Of course, I'm saying this jokingly. I don't think our drones today can be demon possessed, but um, it's a fun story, and I just glad that I was able to use a second one for the rest of the trip. But anyway, that happened right over here. There, you can see the area of Kersey, the traditional location, but the cliff is just about three-fourths of a mile south. So here's the lake. You can see and read on your own some of the events, what Jesus did. Of course, he taught, he healed, he performed miracles, he displayed compassion. There was an archaeologist, really a lay archaeologist named Mendel Noon, who I believe in the 90s identified about 15 harbors around the lake. So Jesus most likely was familiar with all the ones, certainly in the northwest and west and south sides of the lake, although this eastern side, like the Mark 5 passage suggests, was more for Gentiles, and you don't go into Gentile areas. So the question is, what were the purposes of Jesus' miracles? Well, certainly they, I think, were a sign of the fulfillment of the Hebrew prophecies we read from Isaiah and Jeremiah, but especially Isaiah, how he talks about the blind receiving their sight and the lame being able to walk. Secondly, a sign that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah. Everything in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures pointed to Jesus, to the Messiah. Now, everyone and their brother were looking for the Messiah. There were a number of messianic figures. Again, as I mentioned, most of them were politically oriented, like a guy named Judas the Galilean. He's the guy who's mentioned in Acts 5, incidentally. But Jesus indeed who came as the Messiah, especially with a redemptive focus. And to do miracles was indeed to do this. Remember, some of his miracles ended up with people believing in who he was. Think of the John 9 story back in the pool of Shalom in Jerusalem. That man went from understanding who Jesus was as a guy named Jesus to a prophet. Maybe he's a prophet. And then certainly the Son of God. And at the end of that narrative, the man asked, "Who is this?" So I can believe in him. And certainly Jesus says, "I am he speaking to you." And then the blind guy, now healed of his, I believe, not only his physical sight, but his spiritual sight, is able to say, "Lord, I believe." So I think of these miracles that even have a redemptive focus. Think of Mark chapter 2. The guy's lowered down from the roof. Jesus not only heals him physically, but even displays smeka, authority to forgive his sins. And of course, there was a group of Jews in the corner of that crowded house that one day said, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Well, it's indeed Jesus who displays that. So, a couple examples of how Jesus was fulfilling this long awaited prediction of the Messiah coming. Certainly a sign, the miracles were of Jesus' authority, power, and glory. He reflected glory to God, and these miracles indeed depicted that. And then finally, as we talked about the centrality of the kingdom message, these miracles served as a sign of the present reality of the kingdom. So, can we say what Jesus did was to display authority, smeka, compassion, in how he reached out to people as people came to him with the inflicted and the diseased? Jesus cared for them, didn't turn them away, but met them on the spot, met their needs where they were. But most importantly, Jesus displayed his messiahship in all that he did. And no doubt he watched beautiful sunrises like this over the Golan Heights on the east side of the lake. So we could probably talk a lot more about what Jesus did, but we'll carry on this conversation in terms of when we explore how he taught and why he taught. And I hope that you're able to join us for continuing sessions. So for this one, thanks for joining us. And until next time, Shalom.